Hi everyone, it's Rena, your favorite book, TV, and movie nerd. Today, I'm going to be reviewing the Grishaverse companion stories. The companion stories include 2 standalone short stories, 2 anthologies, and a graphic novelization of one of the short stories. If you'll remember from my first video in this series, I decided not to put the graphic novelization on my TBR simply because I didn't feel like reading the same story twice. Also in that first video, I hadn't yet decided if I was going to read the companion stories throughout the read-a-thon interspersed with the other books, or if I would save them to read at the end. Clearly, I decided to save them for the end. Over the past 2 days, I have read all 4 of the companion stories in chronological order of publication. The Tailor, published in 2013, The Language of Thorns, published in 2017, The Lives of Saints, published in 2020, and The Demon in the Wood, published in 2022. The Demon in the Wood is the short story that was adapted into a graphic novel, which I elected not to read. The first story I'm going to talk about is The Tailor, a short story encompassing a new scene set during the events of Shadow and Bone, but told in Jenya's first-person POV. It's about 15 pages long, and it took me about 10 or so minutes to read on the night of April 6th. The only way to read it, at least that I could find, was in PDF form online. I found a free version on the website Scribd, which I will link in the description for anyone who's interested. All in all, I give The Tailor 4 stars. It's a beautifully told story, yet another example of pretty exterior, ugly interior, which is a running theme throughout the Grishaverse. It's pretty dark thematically, more so than the Shadow and Bone trilogy, but not quite as dark as the Six of Crows duology. I would say it's on the same level as the King of Scars duology. I loved finally getting Jenya's POV. I love her voice, her storytelling, her observations, how she describes things. Her perspective confirmed my opinion that Jenya should have had POV chapters in the King of Scars duology. It was a missed opportunity. Of course, I love the mention of David, the love of Jenya's life, and I like seeing Alina and Jenya's friendship from Jenya's perspective, but I hate pretty much everybody else who's in this story. I hate the King of Rabka for raping her repeatedly. I hate the Queen, not just for knowing that her husband is a rapist, but essentially acting as a madam and pushing her servants towards him. I hate the Darkling for enabling this entire situation and turning a blind eye to it because it's more convenient for him. I hate that all 3 of these adults decided that not only is this an acceptable way to treat Jenya, or anyone for that matter, but it's just collateral damage. I can't. I also hate all of the other Grisha except for Alina for icing Jenya out for no reason. All they see is that she's being treated differently and is closer to the royal family than the other Grisha. None of them have stopped to think about what that might mean for her, how isolating that might be for her, how disadvantaged she is in terms of learning how to control her powers because she is no longer in training with the rest of the Grisha. And apparently none of them see the fact that she's only close to the royal family so that they can abuse her. They also ice her out in part because she is one of the Darkling's favorites and trusted spies. Again, nobody has stopped to think about how isolating that might be for Jenya, and the fact that the Darkling is using her for his own gain, allowing her to be abused because her position near the royal family is useful to him. Whether or not the other Grisha notice that Jenya has the position she has so that her abusers can keep her close, they should not treat her badly because of decisions that were made for her. It's not like Genya woke up one day and was like, I would like to be close to the royal family. The Darkling took her as a child from her family and gave her to the queen as a gift, as if she was a little doll or something. Genya had no choice in any of this, so the fact that everybody else is blaming her for her supposed special treatment is ridiculous at best and criminal at worst. I get why she burned Alina's letters to Mal, given her situation and the Darkling's manipulation. It was still wrong to do that, but it broke my heart for Genya that she felt like she had to, rather than made me mad at Genya. There's nothing to be mad at her for. She's an abused kid in a bad situation. It's crazy to see her evolution after reading all of the main books in the Grishaverse. She grows and changes so much throughout the 5 books that she's in, and becomes way more sure of herself, both in terms of her personality and her Grisha ability. After reading the story, I can't believe that Genya and Nina are not better friends, because they have so much in common. Their mindsets, their approaches to life, their approaches to Grisha power, how much they love food and fine clothes, and how much they want to enjoy life. I know that Genya is technically Nina's superior, but come on, how are you not besties? This story also highlights that Genya really cannot catch a break at all through the whole series. She's abused by the king and queen. She's manipulated by the Darkling. She is bullied by the other Grisha. She is tortured beyond recognition. And then when she finally puts herself back together and starts making a happy life for herself, her husband is murdered. Stab me right in the heart, why don't you? Poor girl. Overall, I really liked this story. My only issues with it were that A, it was not long enough, and B, it made me resent the lack of Genya's POV in the series. Next up, we have The Language of Thorns, which is an anthology of Grishaverse lore. Essentially, the fairy tales, folk tales, myths, and other stories that the characters in the main series would have grown up with. I read the ebook, which is about 250 pages in about 2 hours. I finished it in one sitting in the early hours of April 7th. I gave this book 5 stars. The anthology is comprised of 6 different tales from around the Grishaverse. They are beautiful but dark stories with whimsically dark illustrations to match. All of the stories are inspired by fairy tales, folklore, and other stories from the real world. The first story in the collection is Ayama and the Thornwood, a Zemini tale inspired by a combination of fairy tales, folklore, and Greek myths. It pulls elements from the folk tales of 1001 Arabian Nights, the Greek myths of the Minotaur and Medusa, and the fairy tales of Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella. In this story, our main character, Ayama, a homely teenage girl, becomes a hero by placating the monster that has been terrorizing her town and exposing his awful father, the king. By the end of the story, not only has she placated the monster, but she has become one herself, and this is not seen as a bad thing. She becomes a Gorgon and marries the wolf monster. They rule Novia Zem as king and queen and are much beloved. It is said that after Ayama and the wolf became king and queen, the people of Novia Zem no longer wished for beautiful children, but for strong, clever ones. I really liked this story. I love Ayama as the protagonist, and I appreciated the subversion of a lot of typical fairy tale and folklore tropes about beauty, who gets to be the hero, and what a happy ending looks like. The second story in the collection is The Too Clever Fox, a Ravkan folktale. The story felt very familiar to me, and it was clearly inspired by some legend or folktale that I heard as a kid, but I can't place it. In this story, the protagonist is the titular fox, who outsmarts every trap with the wits, skill, and wiliness that he learned as the ugly runt of the litter. He is bested by a woman who pretends to be helpless, but is actually an excellent hunter and very dangerous to him. In order to save himself when she captures him, he finally asks for help, which he never does, and his best friend, a bird, comes to his rescue, pecking out the hunter's eyes and saving his life. This story also subverts several tropes about gender, intelligence, and beauty. I think it's also worth noting that Fly is often referred to as the too clever fox or the fox throughout the main books. This story clearly inspired that nickname because he is very similar to the titular too clever fox. The next story is The Witch of Duva, a Ravkan fairy tale inspired by Hansel and Gretel. The protagonist is a teenage girl named Nadia from the rural town of Duva, who is raised to believe that monsters in the woods, most likely the notorious Witch of Duva, are responsible for making local girls disappear, never to be seen or heard from again. At the same time, a very harsh winter causes her father to lose his job, which makes him very restless, and also leads to a famine, which causes her mother and many others in the town to grow ill and die. Shortly thereafter, her father remarries a woman who she thinks hates her, so she runs off into the woods to the home of the notorious witch. Nadia becomes her assistant in exchange for room and board. Through this experience, she learns that the supposed monsters around her are not monsters at all. The notorious witch is Grisha, implied to be a healer. Her stepmom pushed her away in order to protect her, and the monster in the woods that is supposedly eating these girls does not exist. She learns that the real monster is her father, who she discovers is the serial rapist and murderer responsible for the disappearances of the local girls. She takes justice for herself and the victims into her own hands and kills her father, which also frees her stepmother. The story's ending implies that under her Grisha mentor's tutelage, she eventually takes over as the next quote-unquote Witch of Duva. I appreciate the fact that the supposed monster turns out to be a hero, and the supposed hero turns out to be a monster. I really love that this happy ending is getting justice for herself and other girls, and then living out her life as a powerful Grisha who doesn't marry or have children. That is a very cool, happy ending. The next story is Little Knife, a Ravkan fairy tale. This is another story I'm pretty sure is inspired by a fairy tale that I've heard before, but I cannot place it. The story is about Yeva, a teenage girl who is said to be so beautiful, everyone who sees her face loses their good sense. Throughout her childhood and early adolescence, she is targeted by all manner of disgusting, creepy men who try to kidnap, assault, and forcibly marry her. When she's 16, her father, with a very wealthy leader of their town, turns his selfishness, greed, and love of spectacle into a challenge for his daughter's hand in marriage. He sets 3 impossible tasks to her many suitors, including the Prince of Ravka and a poor tide maker named Semyon. Both men view Yeva as a beautiful trophy to be won, not a person, and become rivals as the frontrunners in this ridiculous competition. In each challenge, Semyon beats the prince and all of the other suitors by using his tidemaker abilities to exploit the local river, Little Knife. The river's spirit, tired of being used by Semyon and many other men for their own purposes, uses him to free herself and offers Yeva her freedom. Yeva hates every aspect of the spectacle her father has put on. As such, she chooses the freedom that the river spirit offers her. She does not marry or have children and lives happily alone and free by the ocean until she dies of old age, not caring about her beauty at all. Similar to The Witch of Duva, I really like this story not only because it emphasizes the importance of being a good person, but because the happy ending is the hero choosing herself and her freedom. There's a great feminist message. The next story is The Soldier Prince, a Kirch fairy tale inspired by the Nutcracker. In it, a poor but very talented fabricator named Drosin makes his living creating all kinds of fantastical clocks, toys, and other mechanical marvels that enchant the merchant class. It turns out that he is actually a pedophile, and he sets his sights on a 12-year-old girl named Clara. He's also a cruel and manipulative man, so he creates a miraculous nutcracker that comes to life at night, which he gifts to Clara in order to spy on her and gain information that will make her fall in love with him. After years of bonding with and spying on Clara, the Nutcracker eventually learns about his maker's schemes and comes to life permanently, turning Drosin into a toy in the process. He then frees the other toys and lives happily ever after in community with them. I like this story for its beautiful descriptions of mechanical marvels, queer representation in the form of the Nutcracker, who is bisexual, and its overall message of finding your own freedom and making your own way. Also, Drosin reminds me a lot of the Darkling, so boo. The last story in the collection is When Water Sang Fire, a Fjerdan fairy tale based on The Little Mermaid. A young mermaid named Ulla is shunned in her family and community for looking different. Rumors swirl about her being half human, which is supposedly impossible. Despite all of this, she finds herself in her exceptional magical abilities and befriends another mermaid girl named Signy. Their friendship strengthens their power and vice versa. They eventually catch the eye of the youngest prince of the mermaids, who takes them on mermaid Roomspringa to the human world. There, she discovers that she is in fact half human and meets her half-brother, the Darkling, who tells her about her birth mother. At the same time, she also discovers that the prince is a piece of shit. He uses her and her incredible power to murder a human boy and create fire that can survive underwater as a gift to his father so that he will become the next king. Her best friend Signy, who is madly in love with this stupid prince, betrays her to help him, and the two of them leave Ulla to die. Ulla manages to save herself by accessing her Grisha power as well as her mermaid power, destroying the mermaid kingdom and splitting Fjerda in two in the process. The broken off piece of Fjerda splits into several islands known as the Broken Heart Islands, where the Hedjit people of northern Fjerda live. From then on, she lives in the caves surrounding these islands, becoming both mermaid and shadow summoner, waiting for her best friend's children, aka the next princes and princesses, and other vulnerable people to come to her to strike a bad deal, much like the one she was dealt. I really like this story, as disturbing as it is, because it is clearly Ursula's origin story. Ulla is the Swedish equivalent of Ursula. I have always found Ursula much more interesting than Ariel in The Little Mermaid, so I really liked this. Also, for the 8,000th time, fuck the Darkling. We can now add being a terrible brother to his list of crimes. If I were to rank these stories from most to least favorite, When Water Sang Fire would definitely be number 1. The Witch of Duva would be number 2. Ayama and the Thornwood at number 3. Little Knife at number 4. The Soldier Prince at number 5. And The Too Clever Fox at number 6. Overall, I really love this collection of stories. They are very dark, twisted, and in many ways more realistic than most fairy tales and folklore. I liked the inclusion of non-Rovkin stories, but there were not enough of them. Half of the stories were Rovkin and half were not. I wish there were stories from the Wandering Isle, the Shuhan, and the Suli as well. I feel like that was a missed opportunity. This collection of stories is very feminist as well. Most of the protagonists are female, usually teenage girls, and most of the antagonists are male, usually grown men. As we all know, in both the real world and the world of the Grishaverse, there is nothing that grown men fear more than teenage girls. There's lots of feminist messaging about teenage girls, magical or not, embracing their power for themselves, rejecting the men who wronged them, aka the real monsters, and carving out new lives for themselves away from patriarchal society. There are only 2 good men in the entire collection, and notably, neither are human. One is the human wolf monster, and the other is the nutcracker who comes to life. The message of the collection is that, as always, human men are the real monsters, and the only good men are barely human. There are also lots of sapphic vibes in this book. I noticed them specifically in Little Knife between the river spirit and Yeva, and in When Water Sang Fire between Ulla and her best friend Signy. There's a good chance that there's more that I missed, but that's at least what I got. I love a twisted Brothers Grimm-esque fairy tale, and I really like that all of these stories are the Grishaverse version of real-world fairy tales and folklore. Next up is The Lives of Saints, an anthology of stories about almost 30 different saints. I read the ebook version, which was about 130 pages, and finished it in about 2 hours on the night of April 7th. Overall, I gave this book 3 stars. Most, if not all, of the saints in this book were mentioned at least once in the 3 main series. This anthology includes several stories mentioned in the main books and nearly 24 stories we've never heard before, as well as some that overlaps with the language of Thorns. Several of the saints are clearly inspired by real-life Catholic saints and other important figures from different cultures. The story of Sancta Naya reads a lot like a retelling of Mulan. The story of Sancta Vasilka includes elements from the fairy tale Rapunzel and the Greek myth of Icarus. Sankt Nikolai is clearly inspired by Saint Nicholas, aka Santa Claus. Sankt Valentin is clearly inspired by Saint Valentine. The story of Sancta Ursula, Ulla from The Language of Thorns, is a retelling of the story of Ursula from The Little Mermaid, and a sequel to When Water Sang Fire. I liked the stories themselves. They're short, simple, meaningful. They have a similar vibe to The Language of Thorns, which I liked a lot. I also like that these stories are the Grishaverse version of the Grimm's brothers telling stories about saints and other religious figures. Several of the stories in this book were similar or about the same people as The Language of Thorns. As previously mentioned, Sancta Ursula is Ulla. The story of Sancta Magda is very similar to The Witch of Duva. I liked that not all of the saints were Rovkin, and not all of the stories take place in Rovka. However, I do wish there was even more diversity. None of the nations other than Rovka get more than 2 stories, if that. We do finally get a single Suli story, but nothing Kalish. I just want more. Also, Sankt those human mechanical hybrid soldiers sound a lot like the Caregood soldiers. I would not be surprised if Evil Queen Maki was inspired by the story of Sankt Ho when creating her creepy Caregood soldiers. All of the stories are accompanied by beautiful illustrations that match the tone of the book and added to the reading experience. I had to wait several weeks to get this ebook. I could have gotten an audiobook version much sooner. I didn't want to, not just because of my love-hate relationship with audiobooks, but because one of the main draws of the Lives of Saints is that it's illustrated. There was not nearly as much illustration as I was expecting. It didn't exactly live up to the hype in that sense, but the illustrations that were there were really cool. I expected each story to be about its titular saint, their life, and their martyrdom. Many were, but some were actually stories about that particular saint's most faithful worshippers, and included the saint as a sort of fairy godparent type character. Sanct Juris' story is about 6 soldiers who prayed to him and were saved from their horrible predicament. Sancta Morali's story is about 2 star-crossed lovers she helped escape, then took her name as their new surname, starting the Zemini tradition of self-naming. Sancta Alina's story is about an orphan girl who leads an escape from an abusive orphanage, not unlike Karamzin. And finally, the story of the Starless Saint, aka the Darkling, is actually Yuri's origin story as a follower of the Dark. The Darkling's expansion of the fold into Novosibirsk, the same events that killed Zoya's beloved aunt and cousin, killed his abusive uncle who was acting as his guardian, saving his life. No wonder Yuri was so obsessed with the Darkling. This variation in stories was interesting, but I think it was kind of misplaced. These are only a handful of stories in an anthology of about 24, so they really stand out. Following the theme of the anthology, all of the stories should be about the lives, miracles, and deaths of their titular saints. These stories and other similar ones belong in a hypothetical anthology titled Stories About Saints, not The Lives of Saints. I do have a bone to pick about Sancta Lisabetta, and no, it's not about how much of an asshole she is in Rule of Wolves, because I actually like her and her story in this book. My issue is her name. When she's mentioned in the Shadow and Bone trilogy and in the Six of Crows duology, her name switches back and forth between Elisaveta and Lisabetta, which is already annoying. Then you get to the King of Scars duology and actually meet her, and her name is Elisaveta. And finally, you get to this book, which is the story of her martyrdom, and her name is Lisabetta again. Why can't we just pick one? Is there a cultural thing that I'm missing here about Ravka or the Eastern European cultures it's based on? Is this a common thing? If you have the name Elizabeth, do you switch back and forth between Elisaveta and Lisabetta? Why is it Elisaveta and not Elisabetta? And why is it Lisabetta and not Lisabetta? I have many questions. That and other issues aside, I did overall enjoy reading this book. I do think it's worth it if you are as invested in the Grishaverse as I am. Finally, we have The Demon in the Wood, a short story about the Darkling's childhood. I read the ebook, which is about 40 pages, and finished it in 20 minutes in the wee hours of April. Overall, I give it 3 stars. The story covers a brief chapter in the Darkling's life. When he's 13, he and his mother, the infamous Bagra, go to Firda, just north of the border, to stay in a secret camp with Ravkin and Fjerdan Grisha. At the time, about 500 years before the start of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, not only is there vehement anti-Grisha sentiment all over the world, but in Firda it has led to the foundation of the Druskala army. Little Alexander, under a different name, is very excited to stay in one place for more than a few weeks, and for the first time in his life begins to make friends with children his age. However, it goes sideways pretty quickly when one of the other children touches him by accident and discovers that he is a human amplifier. Two children then attack him, intending to kill him and use his bones as amplifiers for themselves. In order to save himself, he accidentally uses the cut for the first time on both children, killing them almost instantly. He and Bagra then manipulate the scene so that it looks like a group of Druskala soldiers found the camp and killed the children. The camp is forced to disband under this threat, and Alexander and Bagra move on to the next place. The story ends with Alexander vowing that he will make the Grisha a safe, permanent home. I liked the story overall and how it hints at what's to come. This is essentially his origin story. We learn how he got his chameleon-like abilities to blend into any place or situation. His entire childhood is spent traveling all over the world with different names and disguises, learning from experts in every skill under the sun, picking up languages and absorbing cultural customs as he went. It was also sad to see that this sweet, lost little boy could have been completely different, maybe with a different mom, or a different life, or different world circumstances. All he wanted was to settle in one place, feel safe, and make friends his own age. It's super depressing that he turned into the monster that others feared he was because of his unique powers. Being able to summon shadow does not mean that you're a bad person. It just means that your power is different from most other people's. Non-Grisha feared him and Bagra not just for being Grisha, but for being shadow summoners. Other Grisha fear them for being shadow summoners, since that is such a rare ability, and many would kill them for their amplifier bones at the slightest opportunity for such great power. The Darkling really lived up to both Grisha and non-Grisha expectations that shadow summoners are monsters. By becoming the person he became as an adult, it was entirely unnecessary. Could have achieved all of his dreams, protected fellow Grisha and all of that without being a genocidal maniac and sexual predator. But alas, that is not the direction his life took. It's also really interesting that some of the experts mentioned that he and Bagra trained with are saints like Peter and Magda, and some are powerful Grisha from the language of Thorns, such as Baba. Not only did Alexander get to study with these incredibly powerful, talented Grisha centuries ago, but they were all alive at the same time. He grew up in the Age of Saints that Yuri was prophesizing about in Rule of Wolves. You might be wondering why I only gave this story 3 stars. My 3-star rating isn't really so much about the Demon in the Wood itself, but the fact that it doesn't quite live up to the potential that I see for it. Basically, what it comes down to is that the form this story took is not quite right. I get that Lee Bardugo was just giving us a sample, a glimpse, a few scenes of what the Darkling was like as a kid, hence the short story format, but I think that this would actually fit much better in a novella recounting the different phases of his life. I picture it as somewhere between 6 and 10 chapters, each one about a different phase in his life, most likely in chronological order. The Demon in the Wood feels like the second or maybe third chapter, with the first 1 or 2 chapters about Bagra and his father, their relationship or lack thereof, and Alexander's early childhood. I would love to hear more about the experts that Bagra consulted, whether that's a chapter of its own or interspersed with throughout the novella. I want a chapter that retells When Water Sang Fire from Alexander's perspective. I want a chapter on the inception of the Second Army, a chapter on the creation of the Fold and the events surrounding it, one chapter about the centuries between the creation of the Fold and the beginning of Shadow and Bone, at least one chapter on the events of the Shadow and Bone trilogy and perhaps even Rule of Wolves from his perspective, and a chapter or even just a short epilogue on him becoming a part of the Thornwood and holding the fold together so that it doesn't rupture. See, I just planned the whole thing out for you. Lee Bardugo, can you write it, please? Thank you. With that, I am done with the Grishaverse companion stories, which means that I am also done with the Grishaverse Read-a-thon. Woo! Arlo's coming to celebrate too. I feel like I should have a longer, more coherent speech prepared for the end of this, but I do not. Reading all the Grishaverse books has been a wild ride, to say the least. It has taken 3 times as long as I had planned, but I was maybe a little bit ambitious trying to read 10 books in 10 days. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to finally watch season 2 of Shadow and Bone. I think it'll be really fun, and I can't wait. I hope to see you guys next time. Bye!